I'm going to do a little brief introduction about myself, who I am, and then we'll get to it. So that's me. My name is Em Sauter. I live in New Britain, so I'm close to you guys somewhat. I'm an author. I'm an advanced Cicerone. Cicerone is essentially the sommelier equivalent for beer. So sommelier to wine, Cicerone is to beer. I'm a level 3 or an advanced Cicerone. There are only 20 master Cicerones in the world, and I will not be one of them. That test is too hard. And just don't have the time management for that. But I'm also an international beer judge. I've traveled all over the world to judge beer. My last big trip was to Australia in 2019 to judge the Australian International Beer Awards. But I'm also a cartoonist. So I do a lot of visual beer education. I'll get to that in a second. Plus, I'm a woman in beer. So there you go. I graduated from the Center for Cartoon Studies, which is a real place that is a school for cartoonists in White River Junction, Vermont. I graduated in 2011. It's housed in an old department store and the old post office in White River Junction. I had some really fascinating classmates. There was only about 40 of us. It was a wonderful time. And that's where I started Pints and Panels, which is my website. Pints and Panels now it did focus on beer reviews, now focuses on what I call visual beer education. That's started around 2019 or so. So I do beer and food pairings. So I pick a style and then I draw the food. I do flavors. So what's a Baltic porter? What does it taste like? If you have this beer, you're going to taste licorice, coffee, whatnot, raisins. I also talk about hops. So hops are the real flavoring agent when it comes to popular beer styles, such as New England IPAs, hoppier beers, darker beers as well, Russian Imperial Stouts. So I talk about different styles. It's kind of the equivalent of wine grapes. So each varietal has its own flavors. It grows in a special place. How are they used? So this is Simcoe. Simcoe is a very popular hop grown in America. And all of it's visual. So it's a really great way to teach people around the world about different beer styles, because beer really it's a universal language. Beer is made all over the world, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Some other stuff I do is I do a monthly comic about beer cats for the England-based Pellicle magazine. I've been doing that for 2.5 years now, so I get to draw cute cats in a brewery. This is my first book, Beer is for Everyone of Drinking Age. Came out in 2017. It was published by the Japanese publishing company One Piece. And then my newest book, Hooray for Craft Beer, comes out April 25th, so less than 2 months away. Oh boy. And is an illustrated guide to beer that's being published by Brewers Publications, which is the brewing or the publication arm of the Brewers Association, which is the lobbying arm of craft brewing. If that makes any sense. They mostly publish technical beer books. Some of the best beer books are published by them. So this is their first illustrated and kind of gift book. I'm really excited about it. So it'll be out April 25th. That took a long time. It was a lot of fun. I also work part-time at Fox Farm Brewery in Eastern Connecticut, in Salem, Connecticut. It's about 45 minutes away from me, about 35 minutes from the Hartford area, down Route 2. I'm there 1 day a week just to get out of the house. Some of the best beer in Connecticut, if not in the area of New England, are being made at Fox Farm. It's a great brewery. I highly recommend it. Come and visit. We are reservation only for the most part, but you can look on their website, foxfarmbeer.com, if you want to come visit, make a reservation, come down, try our beers. We make all manner of beers, whatever you like, we've got it. And I've been working there for almost 4 years now. So before I talk about women in beer, I want to talk about beer in general. This is a big touchstone for me as a beer drinker, that beer is gender neutral. Beer doesn't have a gender. People come into Fox Farm all the time and they're like, I don't want that beer. It's girly. It's pink. No. There's no manly beer. There's no girly beer. There's just beer. Beer is for everyone. You drink what you want. You enjoy what you like. Never feel weirded out by the things that you enjoy with beer. That's something that's incredibly important to myself as a beer drinker and in being in the beer industry. whatever you want to drink, it doesn't really matter. You know, people are always like, oh, I like Bud Light. Bud Light's great. Drink Bud Light. That's totally fine. My only request is that you get out of your comfort zone a little and try something different. We make a great light lager at Fox Farm, a little different than Bud Light. But if you can kind of see the progression of beer, that's something like, don't ever let anyone tell you what you like is wrong when it comes to beer. And beer is a gender that doesn't exist. Beer has no gender. Beer is gender neutral. So when I talk about women in beer, I'm talking about the actual women working in the beer industry historically, now in indigenous settings. So yeah, that's going forward. Drink what you want. That's very important to Pints and Panels. If you follow me on social media, you'll see that I'm like, beer's for everyone. Drink what you want. You know, don't worry about it. Beer's fun. And this is going to be, this talk gets a little heavy sometimes. And it's not as uplifting as I would thought when I was researching this talk. Excuse me. It was kind of shocking how you think that brewing, a job, I know a woman did this back thousands of years ago. You think that would be an empowering feature. But it was really in reality the only thing they could do. And so they took that and used it. So, all right, let's get to that. So the talk begins in the Fertile Crescent. So we're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, those areas. That's the Fertile Crescent. So when you look at beer, we're going back thousands of years. We're going back to about 4,000, 3,000 BC. And the first really like civilization that takes beer is the Sumerian culture. They create laws enacted to beer, brewing. There's lots of different beer styles, and women are in charge of brewing and they're in charge of taverns. So by 3000 BC, they have a written language, they have beer recipes, they have taxation about beer. So how much of beer could be taxed, laws about beer, drunkenness, all this sorts of things. Beer was incredibly important to them. It was a huge source of their identity and their lifestyle. Beer is very important to a lot of ancient cultures, but then also when you look into the Middle Ages and whatnot, mostly because, and I'll get to why it's important, but water can kill you if it's got, whatnot. But when you make beer, you're boiling the water, hence you're killing anything that could kill you. So beer is a huge lifeline to everyone, children, adults, everybody, women, men, because it literally can save your life if you drink it. It won't kill you like water will. I mean, most water sources were fine, but if it was stagnant or whatnot, beer was kind of a safer bet. So like I said, in Sumerian culture, women are the brewers and they're the tavern owners. That doesn't mean that they could get divorced, they could own land, they could do other things that a lot of places couldn't do, but it was still a very patriarchal society. So when a woman, and you'll see this actually again and again in the how beer history and women's history evolves, this is a theme throughout history. I'm a woman, I need to make money. What can I do? You can brew beer. And that's really about it, other than certain other things. And that's really how beer becomes known in the women's sphere. So in Sumerian life, they're brewing beer because what else are you going to do? So just like today, there are many they have crazy beer styles. They have a diet beer. They have lots of different beer styles. A lot of their beers were flavored with what they had available. So when you look at beer styles and how they evolve, and if you watch the YouTube video about around the world, beer is very changed by local ingredients. So what do you have lying around that you can brew with? Sumerian culture uses grapes and honey as a fermentable sugar, because both those, honey can get turned into mead and grapes can get turned into wine, but they're sugar, they ferment. So if you add it to beer, you can use it as a flavoring agent. You can use it to bump the alcohol level up. You can use it to dry it out because it's fermenting out. The sugar's fermenting out, that is, and turning to alcohol and CO2. So it's really fascinating how many different beer styles. The Egyptians, who we'll talk about next, used pistachios in their beer, rose petals, all sorts of things, all sorts of flavorings. So, when you go into a beer store now and you're kind of like, oh my gosh, the beer aisle is huge. They didn't really have that, but they were pretty damn close. So it's exciting to see how like thousands of years ago, they essentially had like the beer aisle of beer with different flavors. So how was beer made though? So beer was not made the way that it's made now. The way that beer is made now in modern times is you take grain like malt. So you take barley and you malt it. So you trick it into creating the energy it needs to grow. It thinks it's growing. And then you go, no, not so fast. And you bake it or roast it and cook it so the sugars stay in and all the flavor that you need stays in. But it stops growing and gets real, like it's about 4% moisture. So it's very dry, but all the things you need to brew are in there. So you crack that open and you mix it with water at about 145 degrees for about an hour. You kind of create this like porridge. Then you use the next thing's called a lauter tun. So you spray it with water, try to get all the fermentable sugars out of it, and then it's a sieve. It's like a colander essentially, and all the water drains out. That's called wort in fermented beer. Then you boil it. That's when you add hops, and then you ferment it. So the way that they make beer is they don't really have the malting equipment, but they have bread. And so they bake this really hard bread. It's almost like creating this like roast barley bread. Then they put it in water and let it soak, and the air naturally ferments it. Yeast did not exist, or they didn't know it existed until about the 17th or 18th centuries. Even further, Louis Pasteur, who we all know for pasteurization, did countless studies on beer strains. It was a passion of his. So while we talk about it, there's yeast in the air right now. There's yeast everywhere. You're breathing yeast as I talk right now. So when they're making beer, they're taking this hard bread, soaking it in water, allowing it to ferment naturally, and then they use like a cheesecloth or like a cotton fabric to strain it, and then they drink it using a straw. When we get to Egyptian culture, you'll see that baking becomes the source of how women can get in on Egyptian brewing. So in Sumerian culture, a lot of cultures, Sumerian culture, Zulu culture, there's Chinese deities, Sumerian, Egyptian, there's the goddess of beer, Ninkasi. There's a brewery in Oregon called Ninkasi, named after the goddess of beer. And there's a hymn that actually contains a beer recipe, which was written, they think it dates back to more than 1800 BC. So it reads, it's a very long poem, but it says, when you pour out the filtered beer of the collection vat is like the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. And so Ninkasi is the goddess of beer. She watches over all the brewers, tavern owners, beer and whatnot, make sure that it's good. The Egyptians have something similar. So Egyptian beer, they take it to a whole new level. I mean, the people who built the pyramids were paid in beer. It was a very important part of their lifestyle. So the Egyptian word for beer is hekt. And instead of having women just do all the brewing, the Egyptian beer scene is a little more industrial. So the way that it works is women bake the bappir, the bread, and then the bread, and they still do the brewing in smaller settings, the domicile settings, and then men brewed industrially. So they worked in tandem. It was one of the only jobs where women and men kind of worked side by side, and they baked all the bread. This is a sun oven that they used to bake the bread with. They also had Hathor, the goddess of love and mistress of drunkenness. They have Bes, who's the god and patron of brewers. So it's fascinating to see how beer is revered. There was actually a recent article in the BBC a few years ago where they found this huge industrial facility for brewing. If brewing at this time, it could make 50,000 pints. So like one for every person at Yankee Stadium, essentially, which is crazy. And those beers, a lot of those beers that were brewed when a pharaoh passed away. He was buried with enough beer to last him into the afterlife. So hundreds and hundreds of pitchers of beer that were brewed specifically for their death. It's really fascinating. It's really cool to see how beer was really, really revered. It was incredibly important to them. There's a lot of reasons why. Great source of nutrition. It provides hydration. A lot of the beers you're drinking, and I actually just read an article in the New York Times that said that a glass of water and a glass of lager provide roughly the same amount of hydration, which that seems crazy to me. But you're actually, if you're not, as long as you're not drinking really high alcohol stuff and you're drinking lower alcohol beer, it actually can provide a source of hydration when you're out in the desert. It also, beer contains a lot of really great vitamins, and it still does. A lot of B vitamins, a lot of antioxidants, a lot of things people need to survive. And when you have a limited diet, or you're in the Middle Ages and it's winter and you need vitamins or you're going to get sick, beer actually was a great health tonic at that time, and it gave you calories for energy and made you full. So it was like drinking, how a lot of people describe beer as a liquid bread. It really is. It's a really important part of ancient cultures. And again, we'll talk about today. It's an important part of today's culture as well. So to sum up, Sumerian women could brew, and they also could own the tavern. We'll see in a little bit how in the medieval and Renaissance cultures, taverns kind of pushed the women out. And then in Egypt, they were the bakers and like kind of the maltsters, essentially, that turned baked the bread that the men needed to brew. So it was working in tandem. We also have to think about other cultures like during Greek and Roman rule, there were the Gauls, the Celts were out, had their own, the Belgae, which was a warring tribe where Belgium is now. They were fiercely devoted to beer. They brewed a lot of barley beer, rye beer, meads, and other stuff. The Vikings were really into beer. This is obviously after Roman and Greek civilizations crumbled, or whatever. So, and women were usually brewing around this time. The Gauls and the Belgae, the women were brewing. They would a lot of times would brew in secret and hide it, so it wasn't ransacked or taken advantage of. A lot of things they were brewing with, because hops were not an essential ingredient until about the 14th century. So they're brewing with herbs that they have available. Some of them were psychotropic. There was talk of use of henbane and whatnot. So you drink this beer and you're like, wow, I feel, then you saw a bunch of stuff, it's pretty wild stuff. So they're brewing with what they have. They use rosemary or yarrow or any kind of herb that could, flavor the beer, but then also keep it. Beer without hops spoils quite quickly, or any kind of preservative. So people were making beer constantly. They were brewing every couple of days. It would start to ferment, then they would drink it, then they would brew another batch. Unless you were keeping it in barrels for a long period of time, which a lot of people didn't do until later, that's how you were brewing beer. It was kind of part of the daily life. You just brewed because you needed to. Hops were discovered and started to be used around the 8th century, but we know a lot about hops from St. Hildegard of Bingen, who was an abbess who lived in Germany. She wrote extensively in her book, I think it's Psychiatra, or, oh gosh, I don't remember. She wrote a few medical books, as well as she was also a composer, a lyricist. She had visions. She traveled. She gave speeches. I mean, she's a saint, so pretty crazy stuff. She was one of the first people to write down notice that if you brewed with hops, the beer stayed fresher longer, which was a huge technological development and agricultural development for beer. If I can brew a beer and not have to drink it immediately, and it gets extra gross and sour, or essentially turns to vinegar, malt vinegar, then we can have it longer and we don't have to brew as much, and I have more time for other things. So St. Hildegard was a huge, since they brewed on the abbey where she lived, she noticed that hops when they brewed it at the abbey, it kept fresher longer. And she wrote that down, and it's something and now she's a saint. So why did women brew? I brought it up a little, but brewing falls into a domicile housework. So Men would leave, they would go farm, they would have a job, they would have a trade where they'd have to go places. Women took care of everything at home, children. If they're on a farm, then there's livestock. Obviously, men would have taken care of that, but women would have helped as well. Brewing is part of, making dinner. It's making breakfast. It's taking care of the house. You need beer to sustain yourself. It's a nourishing part of everyone's lifestyle from calories and whatnot. So brewing was part of the women's work, essentially. So that's why women brewed. It was really hard work too. So it made a great trade and barter system for people in the Middle Ages. So here's a pitcher of ale. I would love some lettuce back, or I see you have strawberries. We will swap for them. And so it was a great way to sell beer for trade. They could also sell beer as an alewife. Women brewers back in the day are either called alewives or they're called brewsters. So brewsters gets shortened to brewer when it becomes more of a man's domain, but the original word is brewster, which is a female brewer. In the Middle Ages, the alewife, if she was brewing for sale, for commercial sale, she would hang her broom, or ale wand, as it was called. What that does is they use it to stir the beer, and yeast actually get attached to it when you dry it. So you're actually inoculating the beer with yeast from the air on the broom. But you would use it to sell the beer. So when your ale was ready to sell, you would put your broom above the door, and then people could know, and they'd come. And it was one of the only ways, and this is in England in around the 1400s or so, one of the only things that women could do to make money. So if your husband passes away, or something happens in the farm, doesn't make the crops you need, and you need extra cash, brewing beer for the town was a really great way for women to make an income. However, beer was really important to daily life, but women as alewives were really ostracized by neighbors and church. There's a really great book about alewives by Judith Bennett, who's a professor. And I really liked this quote that was, "Were not women, as daughters of Eve, naturally more deceptive and wicked than men? By such logic, any alewife, no matter how friendly and open, was suspected of being a secret swindler." So women were kind of ostracized, even though it was like the only thing they could do to make money. There were rumors that would circulate. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the broom. She needs a cauldron to make beer. They have the cats to kill the mice, because the mice get into the malt. That's kind of where the whole witchcraft iconography comes from. It's loose. If you ever look at pictures of drawings of alewives from about the 16th and 17th centuries, they have a pointy hat, and the drawing is it's kind of a caricature. So the woman has the long nose and the big ruffled collar, and she's older. So a lot of these women who, their husbands are gone, and they're just, they're trying to live on their own, and they're making ale, they did get a lot of scrutiny from it. And I find that to be very strange, how what a raw deal you get. You're just trying to make a living to provide for your family, and everyone, even though they're buying your product and they need your product, he's giving you the side eye. It's just feels strange. So not everyone could brew and just put their beer out there. There was actually a job called the ale taster, which is a real person, and they were in charge of quality control. So no one was getting poisoned. In Germany, this is in England, but in Germany in 1512, they enacted the Reinheitsgebot, which is a law that's still in effect to this day, that says you can only brew with hops, water, and malt. And then they added yeast later when they discovered that yeast actually existed. So the ale taster comes to the home and tries the beer. If he deems the beer to be poor, you would get a court summons. This happened to women far more than men. They were essentially profiled, and it was a very tough life. So if you had to be in good your beer had to be good, but you had to make sure that your ale taster wasn't a jerk. And so you could make a living. And it was really rough out there for alewives. They kind of got a raw deal. And a lot of them, when Judith Bennett wrote her book, she found it's really hard to find historical records of women in brewing because there's nothing that really exists about them because it was a domicile activity. So no one's really writing about it. There's recipes in cookbooks when you get into the 18th century, but she found that it was really easy to find court records of women in the 1400s and 1500s who had been summoned to court for their poor quality ale. That's how she got into it and realized that women far exceeded men in getting called to court, and they would have to pay a fine or the jail time. Being an alewife sounds really tough. I don't know how these ladies did it, and it's rough out there. So what I wanted to know, tell everyone what are they brewing? What does it taste like? So medieval beer is probably a little smoky, a little dark, and sour. So smoke is going to be from in about the 18th century. They discovered indirect kilning. So you put the heat source below, and then there's a grate. So it's not directly being smoked. And then it's going to be, there's direct fire, then it's going to be dark because you really didn't have temperature control for the malt. You just kind of threw it in and hope for the best. So it probably got on the dark side and a little charred. And then sour because there's no quality control in terms of yeast. And when you have yeast in the air, you also have bacteria and wild yeast that can create, there's lactobacillus in the air, what sours yogurt. And that's bacteria, and that'll make the beer kind of lemony and acidic. There's also, when beer comes in contact with oxygen and beer are not friends. It can create acetic acid, which is what creates vinegar. That's how vinegar is created from Acetobacter. And then there's wild yeast like Brettanomyces in the air, which can make a funky, fruity taste. So the beer it's not being fermented super long because of the worry about acetic acid and vinegar. So it's kind of this like tart, sour, dark beer. It probably was fine. You drank it fast. You drank what you needed to. So, but there was lots of different other styles. I really like how, and they still make it to this day. It's a commercial product. So now it's probably brewed majority by men. But in Finland, they had a beer, Brewsters would brew a beer called Sati. Sati is with rye malt. So they have rye, and then you use juniper branches and you put it in this thing called a korma, which is a hollowed out log. And you kind of use that as your brewing vessel. And then you let the beer kind of wash in through that and then drain out, and then you boil it for a really long time and let it ferment with bread yeast, actually. So the yeast from bread. It's quite high alcohol. It can be, and it can also be served not carbonated, so it's still. But it can be carbonated. It's hard to find an authentic version here in America. I've actually never had an authentic Sati. But in the Middle Ages, women all over were brewing. And after I talk about how women progress here in America and elsewhere, I'll talk about indigenous beers, African beers brewed other places, South America and Asia, where women are still brewing with what they have available, and it's still part of their realm. So why did the alewives go away? So there's a couple reasons. Beer guilds start showing up when beer gets more industrialized. There's more technology. The thermometer shows up in the 1700s or early 1700s. Beers get larger, towns get larger, the Industrial Revolution starts. So the creation of beer guilds and trading guilds, the largest one being the Hanseatic League, which was down through northern Germany, and all those towns had guilds that essentially was the union of the day, making sure everyone got a fair shake, making sure the prices didn't get gouged, making sure the taxation was fair. Women could join a guild, but not as a full member. So they didn't get the benefits of being a guild. So the guild makes all the decisions about pricing, and the woman isn't there to decide or give her opinion. So guilds kind of push alewives out because they don't really have a say in beer. What they're going to decide where beer is brewed. and the alewives aren't part of it. There's also the creation of large scale brewing in tavern. So kind of reverting back to how Sumerians had taverns, they would drink outside the home. Then in the Middle Ages, you didn't go down to the pub for a pint, you drank at home, and you brewed your own beer. Now with the creation of taverns and pubs, those are overseen. Women can work in the pub, but they're not owned by women. And so women are pushed out as taverns. People start going into town for a beer. They're less likely to drink at home. And then larger scale breweries that have been around forever. In Germany, a lot of monks were brewing beer. So the monastery had control over the beer. And women aren't in there, they're nuns. And there is a brewing nun. I'll talk about her in a little bit. But, men oversee the tavern. And so women are less likely to brew at home for their families. And it's better to just go down to the pub, buy a pail, and come home. And then industrialization, the first industrialized beer is porter in the 18th century, millions upon millions of barrels with steam power. And then the railroad shows up and there's canals being built. Beer becomes less household work and more trade. Brewers, the guild is a trade profession, and they join with bakers and other such trades and to form unions and guilds. Women don't get those kind of luxuries to do that. Women can still work at certain breweries in certain capacities, and I'll talk about that in a second, but women aren't in control. When the alewives and when it was a domicile task, women were brewing, and it was an easy way for them, or not easy, but it was a way for them to make money. And then when industrialization happens, they lose that. Other jobs, factory work and whatnot for women come into effect. So it's not like, they're out of luck, but at the same time, beer becomes not a viable career option. Like I said, women could still work at the brewery, but they weren't brewers. There's Guinness had keg washers at their Dublin facility in the early 20th century. There was other tasks they could do, secretarial and whatnot, work, typing, stereotypical stuff, but they weren't brewing. And that was a thing that they lost, thousands of years of them being in charge of brewing, and then industrialization and guilds and whatnot. And men are like, out you go. So, there's still, I always think of Laverne and Shirley from the 70s working that production line. Women could work in a brewing facility, for sure, but they're not in charge. They're just cogs in the wheel to be there to help that make the beer possible, but they're not brewing the beer. That changes, but it also changes that if you look at marketing practices, with the, I think of Bass Ale, which everyone knows, that red triangle from England, that was the first trademark ever. Literally, there had never been a trademark until that triangle in the 19th century. So when beer starts becoming a marketable product, women are used in beer ads, but they're kind of holding it and they're the pretty face. When you get into the 50s and 60s and the 40s, they're serving the beer. They're in the ads, and women are in a lot of beer ads, some more scantily clad than others. That's more of a 90s thing I found. And it's actually a very short window, which is I'm okay with. Marketing practices shape. The six-pack is invented. I can't find if this is true, but there is a beer myth, I think, that the six-pack invented because it was what a woman could carry out of the grocery store. It was easy for her to manage. If it were heavier, then she couldn't manage it with her groceries. I don't know if that's actually true or not. And I tried to find instances of that. I couldn't. But when you're looking at beer ads, I didn't draw these because I wanted you to see the real ones. I tried to draw them and it didn't look right. Men are enjoying the beer. The woman is serving the beer. There are ads specifically focused and catered to women, but they're a diet beer. Miller Lite, which we all know now, that was invented as a diet beer. It actually invented by, was it Rheingold or Schaefer? I don't remember. And then Miller Lite bought it and put it out in the 70s and then used marketing to taste great, less filling, instead of catering it to women like this Ballantine, fewer calories than any other leading brand. that kind of goes away when you look in the 70s and 80s of beer. It's all about using that light lager to talk about, drink as many as you'd like. Doesn't fill you up. It's not really about women. I actually have a Miller High Life ad framed in my house that has like two men smoking in front of like drinking beer, and they're like, "Beer's a man's world," which I think is, and I'm like, no, it's not. It really isn't. And it's getting less and less so every day, which I like. So I wanted to highlight some women beer pioneers and today's stars. There's a lot of great women in beer. This merely is just a light discussion of them. There are many that I have missed, and I want to apologize. I think that there are some really great women out there that have done a lot, specifically when you look at the women of the 70s and 80s. So to give a light history behind the rise in craft beer and microbrew beer, in the late 70s, President Jimmy Carter signs the law legalizing homebrewing. So from Prohibition until the 70s, you couldn't brew at home. It was illegal. You could get, it was actually, I think, still illegal till like, no, it gets a federal law. So it was state by state. So you couldn't brew beer in your home until about the late 70s. So once people can brew, or they were doing it, but it was illegal. Once you can brew beer, people realize that they love it and they want to start brewing commercially. In the late 70s, there are only about 44 breweries in America. That's it. Most of them are brewing light lagers. There's nothing really else. It's a lot of like Bud, Miller, Coors, those brands, or like Pabst, Hamm's, those like heritage brands that we call now, that are still around. But there are some women that really broke the mold and started brewing their own beer and riding that wave of microbrewing. So I wanted to highlight some of them. One of them is Kim Jordan. Kim Jordan founded New Belgium, which is the 4th largest craft brewery in America, with her now ex-husband, Jeff. After the divorce, she was the first female CEO of brewing. She was in charge. That brewery is gigantic. It is actually now owned by the Japanese. It's owned by Kirin Lion. But she was one of the first that, with her husband, who was the brewer, she did all the administration stuff. And she was the first CEO. She is a very, very, very wealthy woman. Now, there's Carol Stout. Carol Stout founded Stout's Brewery in Pennsylvania, which is also a steakhouse, which does not exist anymore. She was one of the first female brewmasters in America. A really nice lady. I got to judge with her at the Great American Beer Festival. She's a real pistol, super nice. Real champion for women in the beer industry. And she brewed until very recently. Stout's beer still exists, the restaurant. So she did the beer stuff and her husband ran the restaurant. There's Annie Johnson. Annie Johnson was the first Black person, not the first woman to win, but the first Black person to win Homebrewer of the Year at the annual American Homebrewer Awards. Her homebrew beers are some of the best of the best. She lives in the Pacific Northwest. She's just a powerhouse of beer knowledge, and one of the most highly recognized homebrewers in America. So she's super cool. We have Teri Fahrendorf. Teri Fahrendorf started brewing in the late 80s and was one of the first female brewmasters in America. She also founded the Pink Boot Society, which is a group that helps. And then I gotta change that. I apologize for the error. I meant to type more about what the Pink Boot Society did, but I must have forgotten. Well, that's embarrassing. So the Pink Boot Society helps women. You have to work in the beer industry. I am a member. It does scholarships. It does conventions. It brews beer. It has beer recipes. It advocates for women in the beer industry. And Teri was one of the people that founds it. And she lives in Portland, Oregon now. She works for a malting company now, so she doesn't brew anymore. But she brewed first in California, then she brewed in Eugene, Oregon, and then in Portland. So she's a great lady. Oh, there's Kim again. There's Rebecca. Rebecca was one of the brewmasters at Anheuser-Busch, their Baldwinsville, New York facility. She invented Bud Light Platinum. So you think about these, like, Budweiser is the largest brewery in in America, if not what's the largest brewing conglomerate. So Budweiser is not actually American. It's owned by a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate based in Leuven, Belgium, called InBev. So AB InBev is the name. And she was in charge of quality for one of their large facilities. They have breweries all over America. So this one is outside Syracuse. And her recipes were very, very popular. I mean, she created Bud Light Platinum. So it's really cool to see, women brewmasters in a really high setting like that. And that's not, they have, she doesn't, I don't remember her name, but they had a female brewmaster, another female brewmaster, but she doesn't work there anymore. That's why I didn't include her. There's a Puey. A Puey is the first female brewmaster in South Africa. She works at Brewhogs. She also has her general certificate in brewing from the Institute of Brewing and Distilling in London. I actually got to talk to her for this. She gave me some pointers and whatnot to bring up. And she's a really, really nice person. I'm actually supposed to judge the South African Beer Cup next year. So I'm really excited to go down and try her beer. So it's just cool to see different people all over the world brew beer and do it well. So there's Celeste Beatty. Celeste Beatty owns Harlem Brewing, which started in 2000. She was the first Black woman in America ever to own a brewery. She started in Harlem. It's now based in North Carolina. I hosted a panel on women in brewing that she was on at Barrel and Flow, which is a brew festival in Pittsburgh every year that highlights Black-owned breweries. And just the thing about beer is that, yeah, there's some downer stuff about women in brewing, but most people in beer are really nice people, especially the women in beer. Always want to talk about beer, really passionate. They love what they do. It's a really nice camaraderie to see women succeed in the beer industry. And then there's Brianne Allen. Brianne Allen used to work at Notch Brewing in Massachusetts. And in May of last year, she posed a question on her Instagram about, what sexist things have you ever experienced in the beer industry? And she got thousands of responses. It made national news. And this is not simple things. It was everything from, assault, names were named. It was a really watershed moment in the craft beer industry. Oh, the drawing of her, and that's her boyfriend, Mike. Mike commissioned me to draw their Christmas card for them. That's their Christmas card. And so she now left Notch and she's starting her own HR company to help companies kind of suss out bad apples or, better working spaces for beer. She also created a collaboration beer called Brave Noise, which was a New England style pale ale that she created the recipe for, that anyone who brewed it was great, but all the money had to go to a women's charity. And you also had to create a code of conduct for your tasting room and your staff. So no one would have to experience anything like the people who messaged her had. It was a really sobering moment in the industry. A lot of people lost their jobs. Actually, a lot of breweries were upended because of allegations, or it was an intense time, but it was a really great. I actually was interviewed about it, and my thing was, I'm really glad that we're talking about this, but we need to keep talking about it, because we can't just be like, oh no, this is horrible, and then women don't feel safe. Everyone should feel safe where they work, and if there's an issue, that there should be a pipeline to be able to remedy these things, because everyone needs to have a good working experience. So the drawing on the right is her Instagram handle is Rat Magnet. And so I drew this card for her. I also created stickers, and all the money went to a charity of her choice. So I wanted to make sure that I raised over $100. It was really nice. It was also fun to draw that really cute, pissed off rat. It's not normally something I draw. A little more people. I've got Sister Doris. She is the last brewing nun in Europe. She's a Catholic nun and brewer in Bavaria. She's been brewing since the 60s at the Mallersdorf Abbey, and she is the only brewing nun in America. Or Europe, excuse me. She's a very opinionated lady. I've heard people who've met her that she's got a lot of opinions about everything about beer, and they say that she's just a real wonderful person. So maybe one day I'll get to meet her. And then the last person I wanted to bring up was Miho. Miho is a sake brewmaster who owns a brewery in Hiroshima. And in the sake world, so sake technically is a beer because you're grinding down the rice to get to the starch inside. And when starch gets converted to sugar, you're not using a solely fermentable thing like grapes or fruit or honey. So technically, it's sake is a beer. It kind of floats in that middle portion. It's its own thing. So now more women are becoming toji. Toji is a sake brewmaster. So, and then she's the owner, and it's been around since 1868. So it's cool to see women. They're about 20 or more now in Japan. So it's cool. I want to talk briefly about indigenous beer throughout the world, historically and in modern society. So when we're talking about indigenous beers, I'm talking about African beers, more homebrew. It's and chicha in South America and in Eastern Asian countries. There are beer in societies there where beer kind of, and the beer that they brew falls into, again, it's a domicile kind of everyday activity that they would do and brew. And then they could also use it for money, similar to, it's almost like back in the day, the alewife. So many places around the world, indigenous beer is made by women. So I could do an hour-long talk just about African homebrew. And I don't have time for that. So we don't have time for that. So I briefly mention about African beers and then other places. So very quickly, I'll go through some of the ones that are made, but make no mistake, this is just a brief overlay. There's way more recipes and cultures, and I'm not discussing. So it's not that I didn't want to, it just not enough time in the day. It should be its own discussion. And I'm always really excited to read about these kind of beer styles because they're not made in America. You don't go to a beer, a beer bar or a brewery and try a, Cayenne, Myanmar style rice beer. I mean, I would love that, but we don't really get those here in America. So certain ones I wanted to talk about. So, and I just read a really great article about in northern Myanmar, they brew a rice beer and then they distill it into a spirit for special occasions. It's like a whiskey. So I think that's really cool. In Zulu culture, the fertility goddess is revered for creating beer. Mababa Moana Maresa. She is also the goddess of rainbows and lives in the clouds in a hut made of rainbows. And I think that's amazing. And yeah, there are stories about how she created beer in the Zulu culture. In Africa, there's different, women have been making beer there for millennia. So you have beer from Burkina Faso. In Tanzania, it's very similar to the Egyptian culture. So the women and men harvest and create different kinds of beer. They have their own, they use a lot of millet and sorghum to create beer called pombe. There's a lot of different cultures in South Africa. They have special beers that they brew that women are in charge of. Reading all about different African beer culture and all the different beers they have. It's like there's a lot of like palm beer, beer of Rwanda. I remember a friend went to Rwanda and had a beer made with fermented bananas as a flavoring agent. It's what they have available. So Tanzania is similar to kind of like a hybrid of alewife and Egyptian. So the men and the women create the beer together, and then women also use it as a source of income and they sell it. They're in charge, and they use it as a supplemental income. So I think that's really cool. So crossing the ocean, we're going to Central and South America to talk about Chicha de Ora. Which is a corn beer. You can find certain places in South America. Chicha is essentially a non-alcoholic soda. It's a corn soda. But they've been making chicha since the Wari people, which is the culture that preceded the Incas. A lot of pre-Columbian societies made beer out of coca, flavored with coca. They used corn and other things that they had. Chicha is still made. I had friends go to Peru and they went to a chicheria, and it was a woman's house and she served them a big mug of chicha. And so what is chicha? So chicha is made with corn, and the traditional way of making it is corn's very tough. So you want to soften it up. So you use your mouth actually. And a lot of other cultures actually, pre-Columbian, North and South America, use this. So you chew to soften it, but also there's enzymes in your saliva that react with the starches that starts the process of creating sugar. So it's essentially the mash tun and the grist mill all in one. So you're chewing it, you kind of let that dry, then you mix it with water, you boil it, and then you put it in an earthenware pot. So it's kind of like the Sumerian way of brewing, but instead of the bread, you're using your mouth and creating these kind of like dough balls, and then you boil those. Apparently it tastes a lot like hard cider, and it's a lower alcohol. And you can also make it with quinoa, which adds a nice nuttiness to it. So if you're going historically, in Incan culture, chicha was brewed by when all women in South America turned about 8, they were deemed chosen or not. These chosen women were sent away to go to special schools where they were taught etiquette, manner. They were usually the most beautiful 8-year-olds, which is weird, but yeah, I'm just telling you what I learned. And one of their tasks was brewing chicha. And so that's one of the things that the chosen women, it was a special, it was a very revered way. It was still domicile, but it was a special way of brewing. And these were brewed for everyday drinking. And there was also brewed for festivals and ceremonies. Even Native American societies brewed beer. They made cactus beer called Tiswin, the Apaches did, that was brewed by women. There's also other Native American tribes that brewed a beer similar to chicha, where they would chew the corn and kind of leave it out, and all the women and the children would help and everyone would create it. So it's interesting how beer is brewed really everywhere. Like I said before, beer is brewed all over the world, historically and modern for the most part, and how, everyone helped, and what you had available is how you brewed, and you can really make, you can ferment it essentially, if it's got a source of fermentable sugar, like malt, barley, wheat, oats, corn, sorghum, millet, and then you use flavorings at what you have, and that's how beer is essentially created. So I'm going to end with talking about women today and talking about women in American brewing by the numbers. So in the beer world, in the latest numbers I could pull from the Brewers Association is from 2020. So there are 8,884 breweries in America. That number is significantly more now. It's probably around 9,500. But for the sake of the numbers, I'm just going to go with that. So when you look at that, 29% of all brewery workers now are female. So almost a third. So it's not a majority. Men still are, for the most part, in control, but women are gaining ground, and women get into the beer industry more and more. Now I'm seeing a lot more lady brewers, brewsters, if you want to call them that. They do sales, social media. There's so many jobs. Brewing is a corporation. Brewing is a business. When I work at Fox Farm, all my coworkers, except one who work in the tasting room, are female. And we do everything, we help bottle, we clean, we label, it's a small business. So everyone kind of lends a hand. And it's really, it's fun. It's a great environment. Then when you look at ownership, only 23.7% of women have, 23.7% of breweries have a woman in their C-suite. So, or directorship. So director of sales, let's say, or, chief financial officer. These roles are becoming more and more available to women, but there's still a long way to go. Most mainly male owners are in charge. And then if you look at, 100% female owned breweries, only 2.9%. So if you look at that 8,884 number, that only means 257 breweries in America are 100% female owned. There are some really great ones like Lady Justice, which is a brewery in Arvada, Colorado. But there's a lot, I struggled to name more than one, to be honest. It's tough. I know a lot more women are getting into the beer industry, but they're still not majority or 100% female owned. CBS this morning ran a story about Lady Justice, and they received a lot of hate mail from that piece about how women don't belong in brewing or women don't know anything about beer. So there's all these, misconceptions that are construed about, women in the beer industry. Women brew beer just as good as men do. We're all the same people, women know a lot about beer. So when you have beer, again, that goes back to my beer is gender neutral thing. There are more women in the industry and there are more entering every day. And it makes it a more equitable place. So some of the good news, though, is that female drinkers under 25 now outnumber male drinkers under 25. So when I go and work at Fox Farm, women come in all the time, groups of ladies. The old stereotype of the mom or like the wife being dragged to the brewery by her husband and then there's no wine or whatever is sorely mistaken. For the most part, that doesn't exist. Beer is now being enjoyed. If you've ever gone to a tasting room now, it has a very pub vibe, young and old groups, girls, men, everybody, children, dogs, if the town allows it. We only allow dogs outside, but it's a great camaraderie, a great environment. And that camaraderie should echo what the working environment as well. So it's cool to see the tasting room when you go. And I highly recommend going to a tasting room and trying the beers and whatnot. And you'll notice, look around. Everyone under the sun is there having a good time. And it's cool that the brewing world, in the drinking world, everybody's getting a little slice. Everybody's enjoying it. So, but yeah, female drinkers under 25 now, out male, so more girls, more women are getting into the beer industry, getting into the beer culture, and are excited about it. And the numbers are continuing to grow. Just like I said about pubs, beer's for everyone, beer's for all. It's a huge point of pride that I mention when I talk about beer, is that, everyone who loves beer and whatever you love, there's a beer for you and you're welcome. And the industry should continue to do so. So, beer's for everyone. And the more steps that the beer industry takes to welcome everyone and make everyone feel good and feel welcome, we're getting there. And it's really exciting to see the future and how women, I don't know what will happen. I'm not a fortune teller. But it's really exciting to see how the beer world, how so many women in the beer industry are thriving. And it's really exciting to see. So, and that's my talk. Cheers. Thank you so much for listening. I would invite any questions that you have at the moment. Let me know.